September 20th, 1066, somewhere on the road between London and York, King Harold Godwinson's Anglo-Saxon army was marching north at a pace that would have seemed impossible to anyone. Harold Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, had invaded England with over 300 ships and was tearing through the north. Harold's own brother Tostig had betrayed him and joined the Norse invaders. Just 4 days earlier, Harold had learned that York itself had fallen. Now he was pushing his army to cover roughly 300 kilometers in about 4 days, averaging over 45 miles or 72 kilometers per day through medieval English countryside. No rest days, no slow buildup, just forced marching with full equipment until they reached Stamford Bridge on September 25th, where they caught the Vikings completely by surprise and destroyed them in a single afternoon of brutal fighting. Harold's exhausted troops had just won one of England's greatest victories. Then 4 days later, news arrived. William the Conqueror had landed in the south. Harold marched his battered army 320 kilometers back toward Hastings, fought another major battle on October 14th, and lost, partly because his men were physically destroyed from nearly 640 kilometers of forced marching in 3 weeks. It demonstrated the extremes an army was capable of when circumstances left no choice. But what was a typical pace, and how far could soldiers travel before their combat effectiveness collapsed? The baseline for understanding military marching comes from the Romans, who were obsessive about documenting everything. According to Vigetius, writing in the 4th century CE about earlier Roman practice, a trained legionary was expected to march 20 Roman miles, roughly 18.4 modern miles or about 30 kilometers, in 5 summer hours at the standard military pace. This wasn't a casual stroll. Each legionary carried 30 to 35 kilograms worth of equipment: armor, weapons, shield, a pack, the sarcina, containing personal gear, rations for several days, entrenching tools for building fortifications and cooking equipment. Modern reenactors have tested this load, and it's brutal. 35 kilograms distributed across your body and a carrying pole doesn't sound impossible until you try walking 30 kilometers with it. And here's the crucial detail. At the end of that 30-kilometer march, Roman legionaries were expected to build a fortified marching camp, digging ditches, raising earthen ramparts, setting wooden stakes, establishing guard rotations. Every single night on campaign, they built a defensible position from scratch. This is why Roman armies moved at around 4.5 kilometers per hour on roads and slightly slower off-road. Not because they couldn't go faster, but because sustainable pace over weeks and months of campaigning mattered more than short bursts of speed. 30 kilometers per day was the standard because it was repeatable day after day while keeping troops functional for combat. The Romans understood something that many military forces throughout history learned the hard way. There's a massive difference between how far soldiers can march versus how far they can march and still fight effectively. Push too hard and you arrive at the battlefield with troops too exhausted to hold a shield properly. The Roman standard, 30 kilometers per day with fortification duty at the end, was calculated to maintain combat effectiveness indefinitely. Medieval armies, lacking Roman organizational discipline and road networks, typically move slower. A well-organized medieval force covering good roads might manage 25 to 30 kilometers per day, but many factors worked against them. First, medieval armies often included a mix of mounted knights, foot soldiers, and baggage trains full of supplies. The whole column moved at the pace of its slowest element. Second, medieval roads were garbage compared to Roman highways, muddy tracks that turned impassable in rain. Third, medieval logistics were chaotic. Armies foraged for food as they moved, which meant detachments constantly splitting off to raid villages and farms, slowing the main body. But here's where it gets interesting. When medieval commanders needed speed, they could achieve remarkable things. Harold Godwinson's 300-kilometer march from London to York in 4 days averages 72 kilometers per day, more than double the sustainable pace. Contemporary sources suggest Harold left London with a relatively small force of elite housecarls, professional warriors, and picked up additional levies as he moved north. This selective approach meant his fastest troops could set the pace without being dragged down by slower infantry. The march worked because it was short-term. 4 days of hell followed by one major battle. The counterexample is what happened next. After destroying the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, Harold rested his army for maybe 4 days in York, then force-marched them 320 kilometers back south toward Hastings. They covered the distance in about a week, arriving on October 13. Harold fought William the Conqueror the next day, October 14, 1066, and his exhausted army was destroyed. Medieval chroniclers noted that only about 2/3 of Harold's forces had even arrived by the time William attacked. Some were still straggling in from the north. The troops who did fight were physically spent, and it showed in the battle. Harold's shield wall, which should have been impenetrable, gradually broke apart under Norman pressure. Exhaustion kills combat effectiveness. Fast forward to 1805, and Napoleon Bonaparte turned forced marching into an art form. During the Ulm campaign, Napoleon moved his Grande Armée, 200,000 men, roughly 800 kilometers or around 500 miles in 40 days, averaging 20 kilometers per day, which doesn't sound impressive until you remember this was an army with artillery, cavalry, supply wagons, and all the logistics of early 19th century warfare. But Napoleon's real genius wasn't the average speed, it was the bursts of speed. He'd march his army almost 50 kilometers in a day when he needed to, knowing exactly how long his troops could sustain that pace before combat effectiveness degraded. Napoleon's soldiers would march for about 8 hours, covering roughly 25 to 30 kilometers, then stop. They'd march another 4 hours if necessary, but he understood the breaking point. His memoirs and those of his marshals constantly referenced the balance between speed and arriving with troops capable of fighting. At Ulm, he outmaneuvered an entire Austrian army and forced their surrender without a major battle simply by showing up where they didn't expect him. The marching itself was the weapon. His troops called themselves Napoleon's Eagles, but the emperor himself understood his infantry as the engine of warfare. PBS historians note that Napoleon's men could march something like 50 kilometers in a day when pushed, marching for 4 hours, stopping, marching another 3 or 4 hours, stopping again. The rhythm mattered as much as the total distance. Modern military science has confirmed what Napoleon understood intuitively. Humans can sustain hard physical activity if you break it into manageable chunks with recovery periods. One of the most extreme examples of sustained forced marching comes from Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign in 1862. Between March 22nd and June 9th, just 80 days, Jackson's Confederate forces marched approximately 1,038 to 1,080 kilometers through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, while fighting 6 battles and numerous skirmishes. His troops called themselves foot cavalry because they moved at speeds normally associated with mounted troops. In one 17-day stretch in mid-May, they covered 285 kilometers. That's an average of over 16 kilometers per day, every single day, through mountainous terrain while fighting multiple engagements. Jackson's success came from understanding soldier endurance at a granular level. He'd push his men hard for several days, then give them a brief rest before pushing again. He moved on interior lines, using the valley's geography to screen his movements, and he struck when his enemies thought he was somewhere else entirely. His 17,000 troops tied down over 60,000 Union soldiers because federal commanders never knew where Jackson would appear next. But the cost was real. Jackson's men were perpetually exhausted, and desertion rates climbed as the campaign dragged on. You can push soldiers to extraordinary efforts for limited periods, but sustained forced marching degrades both numbers and combat effectiveness. Modern military research has quantified what historical commanders learned through trial and error. A forced march, defined as marching longer than 8 hours or at a pace above the sustainable rate, can cover 56 kilometers or more in a day under good conditions, but you lose roughly 1/3 of your force to exhaustion, injuries, and stragglers. Soldiers develop blisters that become infected. Feet break down, literally. Joints fail. Cardiovascular systems max out. And here's the killer. Mental fatigue compounds physical exhaustion. soldiers become unable to follow complex orders, make tactical decisions, or maintain formation under fire. The historical record is full of battles lost because armies arrived too exhausted to fight properly. Harold at Hastings. Austrian armies outmaneuvered by Napoleon because they couldn't sustain his marching pace. Confederate forces in the later stages of the Valley Campaign were barely able to hold their weapons. The Roman standard of 25 to 30 kilometers per day existed for a reason. It was the sustainable pace that kept soldiers functional for combat over months of campaigning. Understanding marching rates isn't just trivia. It's fundamental to understanding why battles happened where they did and when they did. Commanders throughout history had to balance the speed of movement against the combat effectiveness of their troops upon arrival. Move too slowly, and the enemy concentrates against you or escapes entirely. Move too quickly, and you arrive with exhausted soldiers who can't fight. Harold Godwinson made both choices in September 1066. He moved fast enough to surprise Harold Hardrada and win decisively, then pushed his luck by forced marching back south without adequate recovery time. The Romans had figured it out 2,000 years ago. 25 to 30 kilometers per day with full equipment was the sustainable pace for an army that needed to fight at the end of its march. Everything else was a calculated risk, sometimes necessary, sometimes brilliant, and sometimes fatal. The next time you read about an army covering hundreds of kilometers in a few weeks, remember that those soldiers were carrying 30 kilograms worth of equipment, building fortifications each night, and expected to form a shield wall or battle line at the end of it all. The fact that they did it all is remarkable. The fact that they sometimes still won battles afterward is extraordinary. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.